In this video, as the title suggests, I'm going to look at the Glock design and, basically the flaws. Now, this isn't necessarily talking about how it's not a good option or anything, and I'm evaluating the Gen 4, kind of comparing it against older generations and some other guns. So Glock was absolutely revolutionary as far as, integrating a lot of concepts, being lightweight and, adding different characteristics to give it value to the market. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the original design of the Glock. From what I know, it's not necessarily that the Glock was meant to be infallible. It was meant to be basically something that could perform the military's needs and for its adoption, but also be inexpensive to basically maintain, easy to maintain, and it did that, and it really set the example. Granted, however, I think a lot of people are a little bit, kind of uneducated about the actual design and basically why it would be limited as far as sorry about that, I got stuff stuck in my teeth, but it seems like people don't really understand why it's kind of limited in its service life, and they think that you can just run these things for forever without having to actually do maintenance, and that is a horrible flaw, and that's the lack of education, I think, and experience. So anybody with a lot of experience with Glocks knows that they are going to fail. Now, granted, parts are cheap, and that's something to like, but inserting a little bit of reality and logic into it basically will help you, work with this gun better or decide if it's even for you. So anyways, I wanted to go ahead and look at some different components and kind of discuss it and, maybe some weaknesses and my own experiences with this. So first thing I'm going to start with is the barrel. This is kind of, something that, it's not a bad system. It's got polygonal rifling, which, they're finding that it has its benefits and downsides. Now, the chambers on Glocks are typically going to be a little bit more loose than other manufacturers, and some people say that the design was basically to give it more flexibility with certain ammunition. I haven't found anything to really truly validate that. That's pretty much a claim, like maybe a marketing claim, but these things are actually sensitive to steel case ammo. Now, it does lack a pretty good crown, as it were, so it's not really well protected like some others on the market. Like if you look at the Turkish pistol from Sarsılmaz, the SAR 9, it actually has a very recessed crown, and that was because of experience, and they basically took the Glock platform and kind of upgraded it to give it more durability. There really hasn't been any tests from the NATO testing that they did, but hopefully that'll come out in the future to kind of see how it did perform. Now, for the finish, some people had this rumor about basically having a diamond finish or whatever, but that really wouldn't make any sense, because if they were able to get something that was basically infallible, then I'm sure that other countries would be able to integrate that into different metals to give it a better durability, but that's not really the case, and I can't really even find references to that style of surface treatment, so I think that's more BS than anything. So anyways, so that's the barrel. It does have problems like not having a polished feed rim. That is one thing that they do like to do, and in the 40 caliber they're just making it work. And the Gen 4 is really the first one that I know of that actually did incorporate a lot of things like giving good head spacing or basically chamber support. And that was a big flaw, is it's like it wasn't even a consideration to give chamber support at first, but the Gen 4 is exemplary for, 40 caliber and stuff, for basically taking advancements and putting it in to where, it's basically, it's all right, but you just have to deal with the other flaws that come with a 40 caliber pistol. So other than that, let's talk about the recoil spring now. Now, the original Glock, you got to realize that it was meant for 9mm, and they were basically just using flat wire recoil springs, which is supposed to give good durability or longevity. So it's supposed to provide a longer service life or a longer retention of certain spring pressure. Now, you can kind of see that that's BS if you actually know the maintenance schedule of every 2,000 to 3,000 rounds. That's on par with the old classic SIGs, which I think is absolutely abhorred, because any advancements over the years should understand that it's probably better to upgrade your spring systems, give it more durability, but it's definitely not worth $1,000. But this system right here lasts longer, and it's because it's a variable weight recoil spring, or whatever you want to call it, dual recoil spring. So it basically helps kind of slow down the basically the slide velocity a little bit better, and as it goes back further and further, it slows it down more and more. Now, recoil springs are absolutely vital as far as like their tension and everything for delaying the actual cycling of the weapon so that the brass can cool. Now, granted that these chambers are a little bit more loose, that can, end up affecting certain things, like they can still be expanded enough to actually cause failures to extract the. So anyways, that's something to consider. These will last longer than the older generations, but anyways, now let's move on to the slide. The slides, they're not impervious to wear, and especially on the Gen 4s, you've got less material around here. Now it's distributing it a little bit more, so I think it has something to do with the weight and being able to add more weight at the end of the cycling. But also, the surface area of contact has been widened out, so it's basically using the sides of the frame rather than traveling and concentrating it towards the middle and causing wear and vibration to a lot of the components. It's really traveling on the sides. Not saying that it avoids these parts, but it does a better job of it's doing a couple things to basically reduce that impact on the gun. So basically up here on the 4th generation slides, or whatever, especially like in the Glock 20 being 10mm, I have seen a lot of failures in this area. I've seen it on 9mm as well. Actually, Battlefield Vegas, I believe, actually had a failure in this area. And it took a while being 9mm and all, and then using semi-spec ammunition, but using something like NATO ammunition being on par with 40 caliber will stress this out more. And this also has to do with the recoil spring tension as well, because if this thing's battering the frame, you are going to get weaknesses. You're battering these top portions, which are basically the thinnest part except for down here, but you'll see the wear in this area. So you can see the metal, that the little bit of metal right here is actually being fully contacted. There's no more polymer buffer, and that's one of the reasons why you get a lot of feedback from the Glock pistols. Is it's not a polymer. There's no polymer buffer between the metal in the gun and the actual components. So, or the metal in the gun and the polymer. So yeah. Just using this as an example, M&Ps are noted for basically having better recoil impulses, and that's probably because it has a polymer buffer, and there is metal supporting it somewhat, but I mean it's not as drastic, and you can see the metal is a bit lower, so theoretically that can help with muzzle flip. It just supports it a little bit better, and it's one of two things. Either you can use polymer as a buffer, or you can widen the polymer to kind of distribute and support the amount of bashing that's happening. And also, you notice on the M&Ps, the front area here, you can tell that it's going to be less affected by it as far as like the constant smashing, even when the recoil spring gets a little bit weaker. So anyways, put that away. So the other parts of the slide, this area right here is prone to cracking. So this ejection port area, obviously there's less metal and stuff like that. So one of the ways to test that is to basically Indian burn it and see if there are any cracks and stuff. But changing your recoil spring every 5,000 rounds, even on the Gen 4s, will actually prevent this. They're not that expensive, but they are still around 15 bucks, depending on where you go, because, shipping included. So you just got to be aware of that. As far as like the parts, being a striker fired gun, it's not going to last as long. Like the ability to properly strike the primers. It's not going to last as long as something like, say, a hammer-fired gun, where basically it's using the momentum of the forward-moving hammer to strike a firing pin and then hit a primer. So, you know, it doesn't really work all that well on some striker-fired guns, but because the shape of the striker is a little bit different, it's triangular, it really comes down to a fine point and it doesn't require as much pressure, so it takes a while before you start getting light primer strikes. But when you're dealing with a hard primer and you start getting gunk, I mean, this thing is not really all that exposed to begin with, but you do have to be careful. The integration of a hole here for debris to come out is a good advancement, but this is something you want to be able to hear pushing down on this firing pin block, or the drop safety plunger or whatever, but that'll tell you that it's free floating. Get in there with a Q-tip and just wipe that out so that it actually has maximum travel capability. And also, you got to be careful about the breech faces on these Glocks, because one of the things that you can have easily is breech face cracks, because it's actually pretty thin. And also, firing pins, don't sit there and constantly dry fire these things, because the metal on metal friction and everything, it can end up wearing on the firing pin, the surface of the firing pin, and dull it out, which will affect your strike capability. And also, you got to understand that it's working on the breech face as well. So this is not really the top metal on the market, but you know, it works pretty well for a good amount of time. Just some of the other things, you know, that's included. The M&P would probably be first to kind of lose its ability to strike competently, just given the shape and, you know, characteristics and such. So as far as the frame is concerned, the locking block on the Gen 4 was upgraded to give it more longevity, because you got to understand, when this thing is coming back and camming, the weight of the barrel and the slide, the force of it is coming back, and it is smashing this area. So this was beefed up to kind of basically take the hit a little bit better. So I think that's actually a pretty good thing, and it does make a bit of a difference. So there's a lot of design combinations that actually do help this. However, one thing with the slide is it is not uncommon for these rails to kind of delaminate from the frame and basically come up. Now, the frame on the Glocks are a bit flexible because it's using a more flexible nylon number 2, as it's called. So, you know, it is going to be a little bit more flexible, which should give it more durability. Typically, when it comes to manufacturing and, you know, metallurgy, material science anyways, the more flexible something is the better it's going to take impact, generally speaking. But, you know, something like glass-filled nylon and stuff, glass-filled nylon, like fiberglass reinforced nylon, is pretty, or polymer, it is pretty durable, but, you know, it is meant for impacts as well as, you know, other stuff. But basically, you know, it is what it is, but this can be susceptible over time of delaminating and basically kind of pushing itself up. So that's something to actually watch for. So that can be a concern when it's not fully supported. And one thing companies do to get around this, like the M&P, is just attach it to the locking block, because it is locked in there with a pin. And it would be very hard to basically overwhelm this thick, you know, fiberglass reinforced frame. So, you know, I think that would have been a better option, and it just allows you to prevent that wear overall and get a more consistent lockup and less worry about the frame being compromised. So if this frame were completely independent, as far as like not needing the frame rails to be in there, like if your frame rails crap out, you just replace one component and you're good to go. But that's not the case here, so that actually has been a problem with some guns. Now, typically it's a lemon, a mismanufacture, or a workmanship or manufacturer defect, but it's just something to watch out for with these guns, and especially over time with the constant battering, it will loosen it up like a tooth. So, anyways, that's just a basic rundown of these pistols. I mean, one more thing is the magazines. On the 40 caliber, the springs do have to be good enough to push up the 180 grain bullets, in a good amount of time for the cycling of the slide. And Glock says they'll last about 2,500 rounds if you're just firing it. They can last a little bit longer, but they've had to do some upgrades, increase spring pressure for better longevity and stuff like that, and it works pretty well. But there are other magazines that'll work a little bit better, and it might have to do with the metallurgy and heat treatment of the springs. But Glock OEM springs are pretty much good to go, but it's just something that you might want to consider is these things aren't impervious, and the first thing I think would start giving you real problems if you're changing the recoil springs and everything else. You probably get a magazine problem before you get a part breakage or a light primer strikes or whatever. But pretty much all you'd need to change is the recoil springs for a while, and then everything else, just keep parts around like a striker spring, a firing pin, or a striker, and a trigger return spring, which is back here. Takes a while for that thing to wear because it's just basically support helping the gun come back. But other than that, not much as far as like maintenance, as far as wear points, but there are some integrity concerns like up here and stuff, so it's just something to watch out for. So anyways, this thing isn't impervious. It does require maintenance in order to keep it running, and there are some things to watch out for. It's very basic, and that was kind of the point. Minimalist material inclusion in the design, and that's fine. But there are other pistols out there which will probably give you a better service life or characteristics that you can work well with and probably longer service life. So anyways, I appreciate you guys watching. Go ahead and leave a comment below on what you think, and I'll see you guys in another video. You guys have a good one.